All right, man. You ready to do this?
Okay, sure.
All right. So five, four, three, two, and one. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have back Dr. Brock Chisolm. Brock, welcome back.
Hey, Guy, how are you?
Awesome. So glad you decided to come back and join me. I really loved talking to you initially, and that's why you're back here. So, uh, Brock has over 15 years experience in the psychological assessment and treatment of trauma survivors. He's a clinical psychologist and has assisted in the development and implementation of comprehensive services for trauma survivors internationally. In addition, he is also an advisory to several NGOs on self-care and prevention of burnout strategies for staff who work with traumatized populations. Brock has provided expert witness in several high-profile human rights violation cases in the UK and international courts. He's an approved expert for the Preventing Sexual Violence Initiative, hosted by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and elected board member of the UK Psychological Trauma Society. How does that sound?
Sounds good. Right. Is that me?
Yeah, that is you. So let's bring some people up to speed here who maybe didn't catch your first episode. And we'll certainly have that linked up in the show notes page here. But give us a kind of a snippet of, first of all, where you're from originally and where you are currently.
Okay. Well, I was born in Canada. I moved to the UK as a kid. I think I was 12 or 13. And then I spent most of my psychological career in London, but I've moved to the coast near Brighton in the UK.
Okay. Okay. So how did this start for you? How did this interest start for you?
I've always been interested in both human rights and psychology. So what I've been working with is the perfect overlap for that. And I guess the other thing that I like about the work that we do is that people recover from trauma, or can do. There can be post-traumatic growth. People can see things differently and feel better afterwards. I don't mean that we can completely take the pain away, but I like working in an area where there's improvement. Yeah.
Why human rights? When did that develop for you?
I think I've always had an interest in what's going on in the world. I very much believe that people are equal, no matter where they're from and who they are. And I also believe that we have to fight for those rights, because in most places in the world, and indeed the places probably with the best human rights record, still have an incredible amount of violations. And if I think some of the people take that for granted and don't realize that what they have is as important as they have, I guess, until they lose it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not really sure where it came from. I think I just liked reading the papers and stuff to begin with. um, yeah.
Human rights. I mean, when you first said that, it kind of hits to the core. Kind of the first thing I think thought of was on a kind of a micro level of like one person hurting another, taking advantage of another, bullying another in a sense. And of course, if you pan out to the macro, it becomes something else. But for me, there's a sensation of, my God, how can I help this other person? How can we help them? Because it stings. Um, did that in any way grow from any of your own experience?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, it is bullying on a state level, isn't it? It
It is.
absolutely is. I mean, and the effect that it has on a person is I think the same. And if a group of people bully one person, I think can often be worse, because it feels like the whole world is against you. And when governments bully a minority, it must feel the same. And so, yeah, I think, you know, when I first moved from Canada to the UK, in my first year, I had a Canadian accent, which people in England didn't like. So I got bullied there for sure, and felt some of that. And then, you know, then I moved away. I was just there for 1 year, moved to another school, and it was completely different experience. People were
Mm,
nice to one another. People, it was in a different part of the country where things are easier, life is easier, and
mhm,
it was, yeah, much better. So I hadn't ever made that connection actually, but yeah, I
mm,
would imagine that very much formed a formative. Yeah, I think that would contribute absolutely. Yeah.
mhm. Now, you talked about, in a way, the intersection between human rights and psychology. How do you perceive that?
Well, most a great deal of um, emotional health is dictated by the things that we experience, the stuff that happens to us. It's impossible, as we all know, to go through life without having a trauma in your life. You know, the only way to escape trauma is to die young. So so we have to accept that. And so difficult events shape who we are and how we feel. And psychology generally, and mental health generally, is really about trying to mitigate the effect of those. It doesn't matter whether a person presents with has PTSD or depressed or and I'm not just interested in human rights, but those are the ones that I feel that there's something on a greater level that can be potentially done so that we live in a world which essentially people are more like the second school that I went to than the first school
Mhm,
that I went to,
mhm,
making that connection.
mhm, mhm.
Um, yeah.
So, in your organization, um,
Trauma Treatment
Trauma
International.
Treatment International, right? So, give us the broad brushstroke of what you folks are doing.
Sure. So I guess actually just to go back to your question as well, why just human rights? So there's so many traumas. Sometimes it's helpful to focus just on a few things so that you can understand and learn what you're doing and become, I guess, better at providing help. So Trauma Treatment International is set up to provide psychological interventions for people that have been set violence. Collective violence is essentially things like trafficking, torture, slavery, war. And our ethos is to try to support not so much directly people that have experienced this, though we do that as well. We work, for
Mhm,
example, with Hostage International, people that have been held hostage around the world. We work with various journalists who are on the front line and so on. But what we really want to do is to improve access to trauma treatment around the world. That's our aim. And so we want to accomplish that by training other people and providing supervision and support and so on in other countries so that the skills are there and so that the people that really need that can access it.
mhm,
That's the first thing we do. The second thing that we do is we work with organizations, normally not-for-profits, but it doesn't nation, are seeking to try to either end things such as torture or slavery, or else hold people accountable. For example, media organizations which are providing the stories of what's really happening close up, or
mhm,
the ICRC, or Human Rights Watch, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, go on.
Just intense. And I know I said this last time, but so friggin' intense, right? I mean, you're dealing with the the just. I mean, it's hard to judge any trauma, but there's no doubt. I mean, this is very hardcore. I mean, human trafficking and slavery and torture is on the far end of the continuum of what we're talking about here. Um, how do you? Well, let me ask you a question here. So those people who have been who have experienced trafficking and torture and been held hostage, is there a commonality in how you approach them to work with them?
Oh, yes. Yes, with a caveat. um, we are it, some of the time following traumas, as you know, people might have PTSD, maybe about half the people. So there's a commonality, I think, in post-traumatic stress disorder events as if they're happening again. And that's a commonality because that's a neurobiological aspect, that everybody's the same on that. We all have an autobiographical memory, and if our autobiographical memory lacks sufficient context, has a meaning which is particularly impactful, then we're going to experience it sensorily. We're going to smell it and see it and hear it and so on. So everybody, no matter where they're from, is prone to having that happen. And if that happens, it means that the thing that happened to them that was harmful isn't in the past. It's the last time they had a flashback. It's the last time they had a nightmare. So they have it again and again and again. So there's a commonality there. And that's, of course, with all trauma, right? There's no difference to anything else. I guess another commonality to some of the collective violence that we're talking about is that its whole systems often said, hey, we're going to do this bad thing to you or to this group of people. We're all going to get together. We're going to try as hard as we can to do some terrible things for different reasons, of course. Sometimes it's to make money, sometimes it's power, sometimes it's just hatred. But that is often different from other types of trauma. If somebody attacks me in the street, for example, it's not very personal and it's one guy. But if I knew them, then it's more personal. That's a difference. But if it's my government, or if it's the government of the country that lives next door to me that are coming in with tanks and missiles, then that I think is a whole. I think that's a whole different effect.
And therein lies the intersection of psychology and human rights. Yeah, I mean, just the way you said that. I mean, my God, the impact, the impact that probably has on most people, to think that a whole government or a whole collective of people has done this thing to them, tried to hurt them or harm them or torture them. Let me just shift here a bit. And what do you think, Brock, it is within you personally that allows you to get in there and do this type of work?
I mean, personally, I do like to know what's going on in the world and understand what is happening and try and make sense of it. I feel better if I feel as if I'm trying to make a positive contribution. I think we're all selfish in that respect. We do some things that make us feel better, and it makes me feel better to try and work in this area. I also find people's stories are fascinating. And I really, really enjoy the connection that can be made from somebody whose life has been completely different from mine in often. So sometimes people's lives are quite similar, actually. But other people I work with, it's hard to imagine what they've been through, where they've come from, or going on. I mean, a country that mainly has a rule of law. I mean, a country that mainly doesn't abduct and torture people. And that's just because of where I was born. I mean, that's just luck. But I really, there's not one person that I've worked with where there hasn't been a connection that we can speak on a human equal level. And I love that. I really enjoy that.
I mean, I can't sit here and imagine what torture or being in war would be like. But it's interesting, when you said, in response to my question, you like knowing what's going on in the world and trying to make sense of what's going on. And yet, when you're talking about torture and human rights violations and trafficking, sometimes how do you make sense of that, right? There almost seems to be, but and yet you said, well, sometimes it's done. There are reasons why it's done. So that to me is very difficult, a challenge to understand. How do you make sense of this harm that one person is doing to another on a very simplistic level?
Well, the last person that I saw today asked me a kind of a similar question. It was her final session. She worked in a war zone and in a prison. That were torturing people of working in this prison. Her job was to try and help the people in the prison. She was there voluntarily. And she needed to be evacuated out of this country because she was traumatized, because she had PTSD from the work that she was doing. And one of the reasons that she was traumatized was that she was fairly young, and she'd gone in with high hopes. It was her first time doing this kind of work, and she went in with expectations that, hey, I'm going to be able to stop the torture. I'm going to be able to stop the horrible things that's happening, or at least, make much more of a difference than, in fact, it turned out that she had.
Mm.
And when that didn't work fairly quickly, she found it understandably difficult to cope. In fact, all of the conditions that would sort of, if you had to design a place where you would end up, and this was our final session today, and she said, what do you think about humanity? How do you retain any hope for humanity? Well, what do you think is going to happen? And we had a discussion about this together. And what we both agreed on is that, first of all, there are lots of things which are getting better, lots of things that are improving. Equality is generally going in the right direction, not in a straight curve, but it's, the slavery is at least illegal now compared to 200 years ago, for example. Right. We have same-sex marriage. We have laws that at least try to prohibit racism. Things are getting better, not worse, in certain countries. What also happens is that in some places, in fact, I think we agreed places, but in places where there's a dictator, by and large, that dictator isn't a benevolent one. They're there to control, they're there for power, money to an extent, but power mainly. And that person doesn't reflect the overall population. And so you get a small minority of people that end up having a lot of power.
Mhm.
Now, within society, within all those societies, you also get a bunch of people that want to follow that strong leader for whatever reason. Um, I, I find it really difficult to understand how that happens, why that happens. That I can't make sense of that, and perhaps we could talk about that a little bit later on. But so you have these places where you get a strong leader without empathy, somebody who would score highly on the psychopathy scale, who either gets enjoyment from control, her to, or doesn't care about it, and those people remain in power. And going back to the question, how do you retain faith in humanity? Well, I think it's a small number of people that have a large amount of control. And I do believe that providing, and this is a big providing, we don't kill ourselves, we don't end it soon. In 200 years' time, I think the world will be a much better place. Unless, of course, there's Armageddon, there's a climate catastrophe. It's the sort of thing like, if we can get past this, things will be much, much better. Things are all moving that way. But it's a scary place. It's a scary place at the moment, in particular. Things seem a little bit more frightening than they did, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean that's a good question that person asked, and I think as you're talking, what's coming up for me is I think the answer, or at least my answer, would depend on where I'm standing at the moment. My where if I'm really up close, or you're talking about from a broader perspective, from a global perspective, and how things have gotten safer in the world, of course. But for me, I tend to operate more on a micro one-to-one level, and I would find it very difficult to respond to that person's question with things are getting better, because I tend to be more into the a closer perspective, and yet I would very I understand that globally things are getting better, but I mean you're dealing with human trafficking and torture, and my God, I mean that's still going on. Yes, albeit on a smaller scale. Um, yeah.
I mean, I think that's what I was trying to say. At least things are improving in that slavery is illegal, for example. I don't mean that it doesn't happen. Of course it happens.
Right.
But there's an example. There are less wars now than there ever have been. Doesn't feel like that,
Right.
but there are statistically less people dying in war than there has been in any other time in history.
Right.
That's better. But then, we tend to see, especially when we focus on the more micro level and the news just generally, it's hard to see that. It's hard to recognize that. I spend at least half the week working with people who are in or affected by the Ukraine. I can't tell them that the Ukraine's getting, I'm not saying it's getting better there. It definitely isn't. I of course read the statistic of death for child and infants in the US is now gun violence. I mean, that's a statistic that's getting worse. That's hard to explain.
So part of what you folks do is you train people, and I'm presuming this young woman was one of those people who you folks trained to go out and work with.
No, this was this young lady, this young woman works for a large NGO that have offices around the world, kind of, like the UN. She doesn't work for the UN, but that kind of global reach. And she comes from a country that has a dictatorship which is very far from benevolent.
Mm-hmm.
And she was referred simply because she was traumatized, and rather
Okay.
than it was one of the less usual times where we provide direct treatment to a group of
Okay.
various organizations that we work at a wider level. But I think it's really, really important to remember what we're doing by also continuing to provide therapy on a one-to-one level, so that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so that we remember what we're talking about. I don't think you can train people if you're not doing it very easily.
Right, right. Let me just remind everyone I'm speaking with Dr. Brock Chisolm of Trauma Treatment International. Just conscious of the time here. You'd mentioned you wanted to touch base on, I think this is a very interesting topic, of how a group of people can follow such an individual, a dictator, if you will. How does that happen?
Well, I'm hoping you're going to tell me, Guy.
I mean, of course, there have been historically, examples of this, but it is a phenomenon and a scary one at that.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I think it's similar to. But again, I haven't got much of an explanation. And the amount of people that you've spoken to and worked with, I'm hoping you can say, hey, actually, listen back to episode 391, and then you'll get your answers. I'm really hoping for that. No pressure. I when I started my career, I worked with a lot of people who were affected by domestic violence. They were in controlling and abusive relationships. And as we know, it takes a long time. Now, some of that is very explainable. If you're economically tied up with that person, you're dependent on them to feed your kids. We can see we can see how that might be similar to being in a regime where you're working for the government and you're paid by the government to do your job and follow orders, and it's very hard to escape, and you can't just get on a plane and just live somewhere else. So there are some similarities where there's kind of no choice. That I understand. But what also happens is, for quite a while, people sometimes some people are almost transfixed by this relationship. They explain it away. They say, oh, no, it's fine, he didn't mean it.
Mm-hmm.
They make excuses. They actually lie to make this person who's clearly controlling and abusive look better. And it's I wonder if some of the things that people called witchcraft years ago, although it tends to be more men controlling women rather than women who were called witches, so that is not the similarity. But it's like people are under a spell. And I worked with someone who she's intelligent, she's assertive. She had a string of relationships that were good, and she came under the spell of somebody who was manipulative and manipulated her and controlled her. And she did this for years. She couldn't escape. She would go away for a week and think, right, I've got to go, and then come back, and eventually was able to escape that. But she explained it like as if under a spell.
Mm-hmm.
And I see that on a wider scale too. You see people at rallies, you see people at Nazi rallies, you see people at I don't know, under Putin, are slightly dissociated. They're not. They're in another reality. We can see it in cults. We see that a lot. I happen to be just started watching the documentary about Waco yesterday.
Right.
David Carradine. So it seems as if we're all susceptible to this, to becoming like hypnotized. This is the bit I can't explain, Guy. I mean, can you?
Well, No, but what's coming up for me is a clear narcissistic
Mhm.
personality on one hand,
Yeah,
and it almost feels like a lock and a key, right? The two
yeah,
need each other to exist. It's very similar to, well, as you said, I think, or implied, an abusive relationship where this one person explains away what the other person is doing. And not only that, but in a lot of instances, is influencing the group of people to enact, right, certain
mhm.
atrocities on a collection of other people. I mean, it's frightening and scary. And no, I don't have a particular episode to point to, but it's I think it's a phenomenon that's really interesting, and that is still occurring today,
Yeah,
obviously.
yeah. And that, I mean, there are some things that we can understand. So, for example, if you manipulate the truth, so people on an individual level, on those kinds of relationships, the narcissistic person and the manipulative, where you can completely control what the message is, where you can completely dictate. Let's take Putin's Russia at the moment. You know, he's shut down now everything that isn't the message that he wants to give. But
Mm-hmm.
what also happens, though, is that, you know, there are these. Russia's again quite good at, I think, sending out these alternative facts, let's call them, where they're using Facebook to present an alternative reality. And I think a lot of people that believe that, I think some people that believe those things want to believe them because they say, hey, you know, I know the truth. You don't know what the real truth is. I know that there's um, kids taken in a pizza, a pizza
Mm-hmm.
restaurant in Washington, and so on. And you don't, and that's because I'm smart and you're stupid, kind of thing. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
can see the motivation for some
Mm-hmm.
people in believing that. And now that communication has changed so much since, I don't know, since the internet, I guess.
Right.
Um, and that does make the world a more frightening place because people are more susceptible. You know, I don't believe that everybody that joined ISIS was evil. They were sucked in the same way. I don't believe that
Mm-hmm.
everybody that joined any of those are. I don't know. I'm not sure that I could define what evil is, but I don't think that all of those people are bad. I think many of those people think that they're doing it for the right reasons. I
Mm-hmm.
also think that there are people that just like doing harmful, hatred things.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
As we kind of wind down here, Brock, who, the listeners here, therapists of all kinds, survivors of all kinds, um, who would you encourage to check out your website, Trauma Treatment International?
Oh, well, we've got a number of good projects at the moment. We're providing therapy to Afghan judges and lawyers which escaped the Taliban.
Wow.
Uh, we are providing training to families. It was for people hosting Ukrainians in their own home, but it's now, the funding for that's now a wider project. So anybody who wants tips on how to host people who have escaped trauma. If you are in an organization or you're in work where you are either exposed directly to trauma yourself from what you're doing, or else you're working with traumatized people, then we have a resource hub about how
Mm-hmm.
to keep you doing the best job that you can, especially if your job is to try and end those traumas.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I would mainly encourage any billionaire that happens to be watching right now who would like to fund what we're doing. That would be my first. I'd probably put that top of the list, if I'm honest. It
Awesome.
turns out, and this is going to surprise you, Guy, a lot more money is spent on harming people in the world than it is on on helping people.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to change that, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, Brock, awesome talking to you. So inspiring to talk to you, man. I mean, what you're doing is just so laudable. And I'm so glad there are people like you out there, sincerely, who are doing this work. So your website is tt-intl.org,
Correct.
or just
That's it.
Google Trauma Treatment International. Again, we'll have that
Perfect.
linked up at the show notes page. Look, love talking to you, and thank you so much for joining me again.
Thanks, Guy.
All right, take care.
Have a good weekend. Bye.